Mass cannibalism sounds like something torn from the pages of a nightmare, something meant for dark folktales or horror fiction, not real, documented history. But one brutal medieval winter left behind a void of silence in the official records, a gap filled only with unsettling rumors and unanswered questions. The silence surrounding what really happened during those frozen months has endured for centuries. Why was it never written down clearly? And more disturbingly, why does the truth still feel like something too dangerous, too unspeakable, even now? To truly grasp how society unraveled so completely, we have to rewind the story to the year 1315, a year that, on the surface, arrived like any other. But something shifted. The sky stopped behaving as expected, and the earth refused to yield its usual generosity. What began as normal spring rain turned into an unstoppable weather catastrophe. The rain didn't gently water the land, it drowned it. Week after week, month after month, the downpour continued with no relief. Fields turned into swamps. Farmlands dissolved into murky lakes. Crops, still in their infancy, were choked and destroyed by the soaked, unworkable soil. It was as if nature had flipped a switch, locking itself into endless rain mode and tossing the manual into the wind. The previous year's grain reserves had already been running low. For medieval families, survival meant living harvest to harvest. So when the crops of 1315 failed completely, those empty grain bins didn't just signal hunger, they screamed of doom. What once were storage bins now stood like hollow tombs of better seasons. And just as hope faded, 1316 brought yet another failed harvest. 2 consecutive years of agricultural collapse. It was more than just misfortune. It was catastrophic. Without crops, livestock had no feed. Farmers watched their herds die off or fall sick. They were no longer managing resources. They were watching their livelihoods decay. And the numbers told a story no one wanted to calculate. Salt, once common and affordable, suddenly became as valuable as gold. The relentless rain had swamped the salt mines, making preservation of meat nearly impossible. Spoilage became a daily reality. Bread, the food of the common man, became a symbol of class division. Prices tripled almost overnight. Wheat and rye were suddenly luxuries the average peasant could no longer afford. A single loaf could now cost more than what many earned in an entire week. Bread, once taken for granted, now became a monthly miracle, if one could even find it. The unending moisture seeped into every part of life. Wood wouldn't burn, grain grew moldy, and damp clothing refused to dry. Roads vanished into sludge. Villages emptied out as people fled in search of something, anything, to eat. But each town they reached carried the same misery. Deaths from starvation started to spike across regions. In their desperation, people began turning to anything remotely edible, anything that might fool a starving stomach into silence. When there's no food left and the hunger gnaws deeper than fear, creativity takes a dark turn. Medieval Europe saw survival attempts that most modern minds would never even imagine. Grass became a highly sought-after meal. Families, once proud landowners, were now on their knees, clawing at the earth for blades of greenery to boil into an unappetizing mush. Weeds, normally trampled without thought, were now harvested like prized herbs. Backyards transformed from gardens to grocery aisles. Even tree bark wasn't safe anymore. Stripped from trunks with knives, bark was shredded and boiled into something resembling soup. Oak, birch, pine, every species had the potential to become dinner. If trees could run, they probably would have tried. Bones, previously discarded, got a second audition at the family meal. Smashed with rocks and boiled for hours. Even their lingering flavor was wrung out like liquid gold. People turned to their leather belongings, belts, shoes, gloves, boiling them until they softened into chewable lumps. Their wardrobes became their final rations. Fashion met famine in the most gruesome way imaginable. And when the pets were gone, when dogs, cats, and even rats had become part of the dwindling food supply, survival took on even darker forms. Horses were bled, their blood stirred into porridge like slop. Some people began collecting pigeon droppings to eat raw. Moss and lichen were scraped from stone walls, and some chewed on clay or dirt, hoping their bodies might absorb something useful. Parents, starving and hopeless, abandoned their children because they simply couldn't feed them. This wasn't about gluttony or depravity. These were regular people, everyday villagers, driven to madness by famine. The boundary between what was edible and what wasn't simply disintegrated. But even this wasn't the limit. Some crossed into territory so horrific that medieval courts were left stunned. Legal records from that era began documenting crimes that defied comprehension. Not because people had suddenly become monsters, but because starvation pushed them past the edge of reason. In Poland, courts recorded incidents of parents cooking and eating their own children. These weren't criminals. They were desperate, dying humans making choices no one should ever have to consider. Judges struggled to understand what justice meant in a world where people were punished for acts born from starvation. In German villages, women were executed for quietly feeding human flesh to others, believing they were helping neighbors survive. The truth shattered communities. The idea of a neighborly stew began requiring terrifying disclaimers. In some markets, human meat was disguised and sold as pork. Unsuspecting buyers took it home, thinking they were feeding their families something normal. When the authorities uncovered the lies, the horror rippled through villages already hanging on by a thread. Throughout Flanders, neighbors began to vanish during the coldest months. People went missing, and few dared to ask questions, because deep down, everyone feared the same unspoken truth. Corpses left hanging as criminal warnings were no longer left alone. Under the cover of darkness, starving villagers stole them away, not to bury, but to cook. Even death was no escape. Even the gallows couldn't provide final rest when famine made the dead a commodity. In some regions of France and Norway, chronicles revealed that the act of eating the dead became normalized among communities who had been starving the longest. What once seemed impossible had quietly become routine. Isolated forest paths turned into killing zones. Travelers never made it to their destinations, not because of bandits, but because human flesh had become more valuable than money or goods. Most recorded cannibalism happened after families had already watched one or more members starve to death. It wasn't one bad winter that pushed society to the edge. It was the relentless suffering that spanned years. 2 years of slow, collective starvation turned communities into something unrecognizable. What remains isn't just a historical record of suffering. It's a reminder of how close humanity can come to collapse when nature refuses to show mercy. These terrifying acts of desperation weren't just random outbursts of madness. They followed a grim pattern, one that made clear that not all people faced the same risks during the famine. Hunger was not a great equalizer. In fact, it created a brutal new social order, where some turned into predators, others were reduced to prey, and a lucky few managed to survive either through wealth, status, or sheer coincidence. Travelers, in particular, found themselves in extreme danger. With no family nearby and no ties to local communities, they were the most vulnerable. A stranger wandering into a famine-stricken village was an easy target, because if they suddenly vanished, no one would raise an alarm. In normal times, being the new face in town might just mean awkward glances or social coldness. But now, it could cost you your life, Orphan children drifting between villages were at especially high risk. With no parents to protect them and no consistent shelter, they were forced to beg for scraps in towns where food itself had become a fantasy. These children weren't just ignored, they were sometimes hunted. The same fate awaited elderly villagers who no longer had family to shield them. Age and helplessness became liabilities in a world where survival demanded usefulness. Hospitality, once a cherished part of rural life, became painfully selective. Villages that once welcomed newcomers now closed their gates. And in some cases, they didn't just refuse help, they made sacrifices. Criminals, outcasts, and people in debt were sometimes handed over, either to calm tensions or protect those deemed more valuable. Cold, ruthless decisions were made by local leaders about who mattered and who didn't. It was as if the village watch had flipped its purpose. Instead of watching out for others, it now watched out for threats. Graveyards, which should have been places of mourning and rest, became targets for the starving. Desperate villagers began exhuming freshly buried bodies, hoping to find one more meal. In response, some towns posted armed guards near cemeteries, not to protect the living, but to defend the dead. Rest in peace became a hopeful phrase, nothing more. Winter made things worse. The ground froze, making burials nearly impossible. Bodies were often left above ground, exposed for weeks. These delays turned cemeteries into gruesome buffets for the starving. When you hear the term winter storage, remember, for some, it meant storing human remains out in the open. Some communities developed quiet systems of survival, rotating who brought food, without asking where it came from. No one spoke the truth aloud, but everyone knew what was happening. The unspoken rules of famine survival governed behavior. And while ordinary people broke under the weight of these impossible decisions, the wealthy and powerful found their own escape routes. Nobles and merchants fled to safer towns or used their influence to hoard food in hidden stores. They didn't vanish. They simply relocated to where desperation hadn't yet arrived. Religious leaders, too, were rarely touched by the suffering. Churches often had secure granaries, and the faithful offered protection. But in times like these, it turned out that having a well-stocked pantry mattered more than having spiritual answers. In remote rural areas, where isolation cut off supply routes, cannibalism became far more common than in cities. Geography became a cruel lottery, determining who would survive and who would be served on someone's plate. And while peasants were left to struggle, the very institutions that were supposed to lead and protect them revealed their absolute failure. Every layer of medieval authority was caught off guard. From bishops to kings, no one had a plan for this scale of hunger. The church, rooted in spiritual solutions, responded with more prayer and fasting, ironically telling starving people to voluntarily give up more. It was like handing a diet book to someone already dying from malnutrition. Kings and nobles found their power meaningless. Roads were impassable. Crops were gone. Not even the crown could conjure food out of thin air. The royal treasury couldn't buy grain that no longer existed. And in that moment, the phrase, "let them eat cake," became more than just tone deaf. It was deadly. Wealthy landowners worsened the suffering. Some hoarded grain in secret silos, while others sold it at outrageous prices, profiting from their neighbors' starvation. This kind of cruelty left a lasting stain, deepening the divide between social classes and proving that loyalty to the feudal system had limits. Very clear, very human limits. Feudalism, once a system of mutual responsibility, now looked more like every man for himself. Even in the middle of mass death, lords continued to punish those who stole food. Property was still sacred, even if people were dying beside it. Some peasants were executed for taking bread from storehouses. Cities and towns hired guards to defend grain from the very citizens it was meant to feed. Markets turned into war zones. Armed soldiers stood between starving crowds and sacks of barley. Grocery shopping became a deadly mission because in those years, grain was more valuable than gold. All of this revealed an uncomfortable truth. Medieval society had no ability to respond to catastrophe. Institutions collapsed under the weight of their own rigidity, and the average person discovered the horrifying reality: they were alone. No king, no priest, no lord was coming to save them. Eventually, the rains would stop in 1317. But the end of the famine didn't mean recovery. Europe had been broken in a way that couldn't simply be reversed. The emotional and societal wounds ran too deep. Fields were ruined, livestock was gone, and farming skills had atrophied. Restarting village life was like trying to regrow a forest after burning it to ash, and then misplacing every seed. Entire communities vanished without a trace. Entire villages emptied out, left to rot, never again repopulated. What remained were ghost towns, silent, skeletal reminders scattered across the countryside, marking the places where life simply stopped. A few saw rebuilding over the years, but many were left untouched, standing as permanent ruins of how swiftly a civilization can collapse. Land values plummeted, especially in areas where former inhabitants hadn't moved away but had been consumed. Even the way people told stories changed. Folklore twisted into something darker, birthing tales of cannibal witches, monstrous figures who devoured children, and ghouls that bore uncanny resemblance to the horrors the people had just survived. These myths weren't just fiction. They were emotional armor, a society's desperate attempt to process its trauma by wrapping it in the safety of legend. The Great Famine left behind more than starvation. It left a warning Europe would never forget. Beneath the thin skin of order, society is terrifyingly fragile. When systems fail, when food runs out, when the structure breaks down, it's not just civilization that unravels. It's the people, the parents, the neighbors, the children, reduced to instinct, clinging to life by any means. And even when the rains returned and the fields turned green again, the memory of what people became when stripped of everything, they lingered. Quiet, but unforgettable. But here's a question to leave you wondering: if your town vanished tomorrow, would anyone even remember it existed in 100 years? If the eerie truths of the past fascinate you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths, where forgotten history refuses to stay buried.